Welcome once again to yet another lecture on the history of English literature. And in our lecture today, we will discuss about industrialization and the impact of industrialization on the Victorian society in England. The Victorian era would witness the industrialization of England, and the industrialization would bring about tremendous changes. Industrialization would bring about tremendous growth in England, and it would expand England's domestic as well as foreign power. So what is industrialization? What is industrial revolution? Industrialization or industrial revolution is a period wherein there is a shift from living in farms to living in cities. So it is a period wherein goods started to be made by machines rather than by people. We know that England was the birthplace of industrial revolution. The phenomenon of industrial revolution would transform the British economy into an industrialized urban economy. It is no more an economy that is based on the farms. It expanded the economy, and the economy was centered on industrialized cities and towns. So the focus is no more on the farms, the focus is more on the industrialized cities. Factors that boosted industrialization or industrial revolution was supported by agricultural revolution. The industrial revolution was supported by the agricultural revolution. From the middle of the 18th century, the agricultural production increased significantly in England. England had large population and large population growth. The large scale production of agricultural products sustained the large scale population growth of the country. The increased use of machines in farming reduced the number of people required for farm work, and thus people could leave the farm to industrial towns. The mechanization in farming was an important factor that would boost industrialization. There were better methods of production and availability of fuel that would lead to the process of industrialization. With the mechanization, more and more machines were used in farming, and scientific developments in the area, many new methods of production was available that would increase the amount of production. Another factor was there was large scale availability of fuel, and it was an important factor as it helped in the mechanization of production. The machines operated on the fuel. The invention of steam engine was an important factor that would boost the industrialization. The steam engines powered the factories, the locomotives and the ships. The new steam engine also used coal and iron as fuel. Thus the steam engine would boost the industrial revolution. Another factor that would boost industrial revolution was the transportation medium, like the roads, canals and railways were greatly developed during this time, and these would change Britain dramatically. Now, how did the transportation help in industrialization? Transportation would connect Britain. They would connect the cities and towns and would allow goods to be sent to long distances. Another factor that would boost the industrialization was that the iron industry was developed, leading to the mass production of steel. And iron and steel were the materials for constructing the tools and the machinery and ships needed for the industrial progress. Thus, there were much industrial opportunities, and this would attract people out of the villages to the industrial towns. The Industrial Revolution rapidly gained pace during Victorian reign because of the power of steam. Victorian engineers developed bigger and faster and more powerful machines that could run the whole factories. Now what can we say about the industrialized England? There was a lot of industrialization. Now what happened to England during this time? As a result of industrialization, the Industrial Revolution, new industrial towns would emerge with factories. Many people would leave the countryside. Many people would leave the farmland and migrate to the cities in search of jobs. The cities were thickly populated and were horrible to live in. The cities were overcrowded and dirty and was in dangerous condition to live in. By the middle of the 19th century, over 50% of the population of Britain lived in towns and cities. So dear students, so far we have discussed what industrialization is. We also talked about the factors that boosted the industrial growth. Now we shall see what were some of the impacts of industrialization on the English society during the Victorian period. There were many impacts. We shall consider one by one. The first impact that we can consider is the emergence of factory system and mass production. The industrialization would bring about the development of many factories or industrial units or production units. And because of the mechanization of production, there was large scale production of goods. Let us take the case of the textile industries. The industrialization brought about mechanization of the textile industries. One of the first industries to be positively affected by the Industrial Revolution. And production was increased in a very large scale because of the inventions like the spinning mill and the power loom. The mass production at lower cost was possible. So the first impact was the emergence of the factory system and mass production. The second impact of industrialization was the rise of big businesses. Industrialization would lead to the rise of big businesses and big business houses. The Britain was conducive to make big investments. Now, England was the birthplace of Industrial Revolution and remained industrial for a very long time. There was relatively peace in the country and stability in the country, which would enable Britain, compared to other European countries, to have industrialization, more factories. Instead of spending huge amount of money on maintaining an army, the wealth could be invested on industrial growth. There were confidence for the investors as there were a lot of native resources, and the engineers and the investors were respected and encouraged by the British society and were backed by the wealthy patrons. Britain had a powerful navy and an empire bringing in resources from colonies, and it would boost the industrial production. So the second impact was the rise of big business houses because the socio-political situation of Britain was favorable for big investments. The third impact of industrialization was the emergence of a new class structure. The class structure consisted of the upper class, the upper middle class, the lower middle class, and the bottom class. The upper class was made up of the very rich industrial and business families. Then there was a growing upper middle class families, and they constituted the business people and the professionals like lawyers and doctors. Then there were the lower middle class. Now who were the lower middle class? They consisted of the teachers or the office workers or the shop owners and clerks, etc. And lastly, there was a bottom class who consisted of the factory workers and peasants. They did not benefit much from the industrial revolution. The bottom class did not benefit much. They had very bad living conditions and working conditions. The fourth impact of industrialization was urbanization. Urbanization. The creation of power machines and factories provided many new job opportunities. The new machinery increased production speed of goods and gave people the ability to transport raw materials. Industrialization would lead to urbanization. So what is urbanization? Urbanization is the movement of people into cities and to city buildings. Citizens wanted to live close to the factories and the factories in which they worked. People moved from small villages to the towns and cities for factory jobs. People lived in crowded buildings. So as such, a lot of garbage and waste were dumped in the streets, and this would lead to the spread of diseases. So urbanization, more and more people would begin to live in the cities, the development of cities. Another important positive impact that was brought about by industrialization is the improved transportation. The roads, the canals, they were built. Steam locomotive was invented. Railroads grew. The steam engines powered the ships at the sea. The transportation was very important for the bringing of raw materials for production, bringing raw materials into production houses. The distribution of the finished products from the production units to the warehouses and distribution units, or taking the finished products to the markets. Transportation is an important aid to trade, and we see the development of transportation during this time. And we see that the development of transportation infrastructure, the roads, the canals, the railways, and they would tremendously help in the industrial revolution. Now, along with a lot of positive impacts that industrialization would bring about to the British society, there were also some negative impacts that industrialization would bring about. Let us consider some of the negative impacts that were brought about by industrialization. The first negative impact was that the working condition was very poor. The people had to work for very long hours. There was much requirement of jobs. Men, women, and even children worked for very long hours, maybe from 12 to 18 hours a day. Child labor was rampant, and children had to work in very poor working conditions for very long hours. Added to that, the pay for the work was very low. They also worked in very dangerous working conditions. Now, many machines were very dangerous to operate, and if anyone was injured, he or she was replaced with another without any compensation. The urban areas doubled or tripled or quadrupled in size, which led to the overcrowding in cities. Sometimes a large population is a good thing, but in this case the population was too big and caused many health problems. The living conditions were dirty and unhealthy. The cities were unsanitary and diseases filled the streets. There were no sanitation codes, no rules in the cities. Many citizens got very sick. That was the first negative impact of industrialization. The second negative impact is changing social roles. Previously, women were housekeepers. Now, women also began to work like men. The children also had to work. The women were expected to work for 12 hours per day, and still they had to look after the family. The children also had to work to earn. The third negative impact is that the Victorians were extremely materialistic. They did not have respect for the sufferings of the working classes and were merely interested in making profits. Now, the lower class workers were merely considered as a means for making profit, some objects for making profit. There was no respect for men, women, and children who worked in terrible, difficult situations in the factories. The factory owners were merely guided by the motive of making maximum profit. Another negative impact of industrialization was that in their race to become wealthy, they wanted to become wealthy, make maximum profit, they neglected the aesthetic side of life. Due to industrial revolution, the building materials were available at very low price, at very low cost. The people who had become wealthy began to construct huge buildings that lacked any kind of aesthetics. There was no beauty in the buildings. The interiors of the building also were inartistic. The furniture was bulky, and the typical Victorian drawing room was crowded with over-decorated things and objects. The sole aim of the age was material progress. A mention also can be made on the women's clothes. Women's clothes in the latter half of the Victorian age were uncomfortable and cumbersome. It was fashionable to have narrow waistlines, and many unhygienic contrivances were incorporated into the dresses in order to produce such a thin waist. My dear students, England occupied a prominent position in the world as far as trade, industry and science was concerned. The first steam engines and the first railways were invented in England. Britain emerged as a leader in shipping. The quality of English ships was superior to that of other ships due to the usage of steel and iron in shipbuilding. The British trade increased remarkably in the 19th century. The other competitors like France, Germany and USA could not catch up with Britain. The Victorians were filled with confidence, and even the thought that any other country could supersede them did not cross their minds. So my dear students, we are coming to the end of this lecture on industrialization and its impact on the Victorian era. In this lecture we have discussed what is industrialization, what is industrial revolution, what are the factors that boosted industrial revolution. And we also considered some of the impacts that industrial revolution had on the Victorian society. Now we need to understand these socio-political situations when we go ahead with our study of literature. As an assignment, please listen to the lecture and write a summary of what is industrialization and the impact of industrialization on the Victorian society. Thank you for your patient listening. Have a nice time.